the idea of letting the dream flow forward in an experiential way is the state of the art for treating nightmares. And there's a lots of evidence for a practice called imagery rehearsal therapy, which is essentially going back to the dream. Immersing in the dream isn't necessarily a part of it, the experiential part. I like to add that, but it's more going to the place in the dream where maybe it's a challenge or where it ends or where you want to change something and imagining the dream forward from there, letting it carry forward. And in imagery rehearsal therapy, it's like um, letting it carry forward in almost any way that you like, or that's the original protocol. But um, now there are also more instructions about making it a little bit more constructive where it goes, or a little bit like a better ending. But that's not so much the important part about the quality of the ending as much as it is letting the dream continue. And so it is dramatically helpful, by the way, just that much, like imagining the dream forward. If you're in a nightmare scenario, nightmares often replay difficult emotions or difficult experiences, and the dream keeps going back to the same experiences. They're often repetitive and stuck, and people get really discouraged and even suicidal when this happens a lot. And so imagining it going forward is extremely powerful at shifting the dream, reducing the distress it causes, reducing the number of nightmares. So just in that alone is a powerful intervention that anybody can do. It's so simple, really. And so what I do in it with the experiential component is I add some things that I think make it more likely to be helpful, and that I encourage people to start with just attention to their own body and being calm and present. So especially if you have woken up from a nightmare or the thought of the nightmare gets you really agitated, to start with just a neutral or a calm body, because so much of what we experience is state dependent. So to pay attention to the state we're in, especially if we need to calm down and kind of recognize that we're just in our bedroom or in our house and we're safe. And then what I do is invite people to enter into the nightmare scenario with a kind of more observer stance, or a little bit further back, enough of a distance so that there's a little bit more objectivity or a little more neutrality around the images. And I start to ask people to look around for anything that's supportive. That's the first thing I do with every dream, actually, is to say, what in the dream actually brings you support? And it can be kind of strange places, like the vicious dog has some aggression that maybe you need in the situation. Maybe you're being attacked and you actually need some power, you need some bite, maybe that's a helpful thing. It's there's so many variations on it, but I usually get people to imagine that there's or look in the dream for things that are supportive, and feel into that sense of strength, whatever in whatever form it brings. And then from there, just let the dream unfold as it will, and just without really forcing it, imagining that, because you're often woken up in a nightmare in a state of arousal. Like, it's usually waking you up because your heart's beating faster, and you're startled or jolted awake. And so the dream is often stopping in the middle of often the most difficult place. If it's a trauma memory, it's often right at the worst place to stop. And so calming down and getting some support, some resources from the dream, and then letting the dream carry forward is already better, because the dream did have somewhere it was going, and it gets stopped. And what I think is happening with IRT and many variations of that people use, including myself, to treat dreaming, is that you're giving the story a place to go. You're giving it a path forward. And then when the dream comes back, which is often the case with these kind of nightmares, you've already given it a route forward, and you've seeded somewhere for it to go. And so a lot of times people will come and go, like, the dream didn't come back, or the dream was different. It's incorporated some of the things I imagined. But often I think it's like it probably does come back, but the person probably dreams it on through it and then doesn't
Mhm.
remember it, because you often don't remember dreams unless you wake up right in the middle of them. So I think that it might be just a I use an analogy which is going to date me, but I use the analogy of like a needle and a record player skipping, and it gets stuck, and you just give it a little nudge forward, and then it can play through, and then it just continues to play through. And the dreaming is, like we're referring to earlier, part of this conversation. If the dreaming is helping us integrate memories and it gets stuck, then you're giving it a little nudge, and then the dreaming can help us metabolize those traumatic memories or whatever's difficult, and the dreaming can kind of do its job. And I've really seen this to be true repeatedly. And I really want to, like keep telling people about this, because most people that have recurrent traumatic nightmares feel like they're at their mercy. They're victims of this very difficult, scenario that disrupts their sleep and makes them feel worse in the morning rather than better. And there is a lot you can do. This particular way of looking at dreams and imagining them forward is something that really empowers people that have recurrent nightmares. And it's still not really widely known that there's something as simple as this that can help.
Yeah, well, it's amazing just to notice that connection and what we understand about trauma, the freeze that can happen, the fragmentation that can happen inside of an individual. And that's sort of how I see you talking about the context of a repeating nightmare. Something is frozen, and then in the process of engaging with it and allowing it to keep imagining it forward, it can start to move. And
Exactly.
that's just it's so powerful because nightmares can be so difficult. Just if someone's experiencing them on a regular basis, just to know that there is this possibility, such a
Mhm.
powerful thing. So if someone has a nightmare or recurring nightmares, can they do this on their own? Is this something they need guidance with specifically? What do you think?
Well, it's something I worked with refugees with severe post-traumatic stress injury as part of my dissertation, and I found that they were guided through by people I'd trained, and they started to spontaneously do this on their own, waking up from a nightmare and going, wow, in the middle of the night when they're by themselves, there isn't really necessarily another person available, but they can imagine it forward, and it does give them something concrete they can do. And it's been shown that people can do this with telephone protocols or with just practicing on their own. So it's something you can do on your own, but I think it's more effective with another person, because it's somebody who is trained in trauma therapy can make sure that it doesn't get going into your nightmare scenarios can be really activating and frightening, and it also can be disorienting to go into a dream state without someone kind of holding the space. And it's so much of it depends on the capacity of the person, the dreamer, to navigate the, holding different, stances of consciousness, one the watcher and one the experiencer. So if you have a meditative practice and you're able to hold a couple of states at once, it's easier. And it also depends on how well integrated the trauma is. If it's very fresh or it's very unintegrated, it's really you can kind of get lost in that trauma state. And so it depends on the nature of the trauma. And I've noticed that some nightmares, particularly the most serious kind, which are directly replicating in a traumatic event, that it takes somebody, it can be re-traumatizing to do on your own, because if you go back into the trauma event and don't really have someone helping you with that, you can just be kind of thrown back into it, and not really feel like you have a way out, because you get overwhelmed. And then it's like the part of you that would be the observer, the guide, that the self therapist isn't as present. And so there's things that can happen depending on the nature of the trauma and how well integrated it is. But I think about when people have I've worked with first responders and people that have had, combat trauma, or where there's something really, really challenging that's happened and they haven't really integrated it or thought about it or wanted to think about it. And it comes in their dreams because it's, the I think our dreams are trying to help us integrate these things, and getting stuck in the worst place because of the physiological arousal that wakes you up. And sitting with people through that, there is a little bit of not just dream work, but trauma work that needs to happen. And sometimes it's just, the well, Jen Lin, who developed focusing, talked about how he said what is not felt stays the same, and it's only when you feel it, experience it, that it can start to shift. And some of those experiences have been walled off because they're intolerable. And so having some with you to say, you know what, this is not an easy memory, but we need to just maybe, in depending on how you do trauma work, but it's not like a going right back into the trauma and re-traumatizing someone, but there is a way that some of it needs to be felt to move. And it's delicate work, and it's so it brings, sometimes the nightmares are specifically about a trauma, and the trauma itself needs attention. And so um, I feel as though trauma work is ideally done with help, with a therapist, with someone who really knows how to do that and how to be helpful. And once there's a little movement, or once there's the dream, you can tell there's movement, by the way, by how the dreams change, which is wonderful. Once the dream starts to become less replicative of the actual trauma and starts to have some other elements that come in, then that's a sign that it's moving. And the dreaming and the person who's experiencing this can start to do some of this on their own. But sometimes there's a real sticking point or a real difficult place where the person really needs someone to sit with them and just be a witness, or keep them company there, so they can actually maybe just look at some of these really challenging memories.